Vi racer sønderbukken. Vi har jubel, vi har sukken. Lange skygger, ingen hygger. Hver en håben har de slukket. Hver en håben har de slukket.
Before diving into this video, please be aware that it explores complex and potentially challenging emotional and intellectual themes. We will be diving into deep psychological and mythological content which may evoke strong feelings or require considerable reflection. And the journey we're going to undertake is akin to staring into the abyss. An experience that can be both intense and profound. So please approach this content with care and take breaks if needed. And if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, it's okay to step away and seek support, as I've wrestled with these very archetypes and concepts myself, thus know the destabilising effect this can potentially have. Though for me, this was a 6-year-long journey of working through the Scapegoat Complex, even though only the past 2 years I've become more conscious of it. When it comes to the abyss beyond good and evil, in its deepest essence, it is wrestling with the concepts of order and chaos and life and death. Having undertaken this process myself, it's not one that most people can easily survive, as it means to not only wrestle with one's own personal shadow, but with the collective shadow as well, and all the various archetypes that reside there. Powerful ones like Wotan, Dionysus, and the sovereignty goddess, that still reside for most people in the collective shadow, that are also key in overcoming the Scapegoat Complex. Yet beyond these, it also means wrestling with much darker archetypes such as Fenrir, the Kraken, as embodiments of unbound primal energy, and finally the collective shadow as a whole, embodied by the archetype of chaos and Chronos in its most primal form. That what, like time, devours everything. Also represented often by the archetype of death or the giant serpent. The ultimate sense of impermanence and change. It also has much to wrestle with its opposite, symbolized by order, often archetypally embodied by an archetype like the Sky Father. With this also comes the split of scapegoat and redeemer. So one is thus really wrestling with the titans of Greek myth, which represent both hyper-rationality with its hyper-order as much as primal chaos. In Jungian terms, Fenrir represents the untamed primal energies of the unconscious. This monstrous wolf from Norse mythology embodies the chaotic, destructive forces that lurk within the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains repressed instincts and desires. Confronting Fenrir involves acknowledging and integrating these raw, primal aspects of the self to achieve psychological wholeness. Which I have to say is quite a task, to take on these deeper, much more primal aspects and to really wrestle with it. Where the Kraken is a giant sea monster from Scandinavian folklore, which symbolizes the deep, overwhelming fears and unknowns that reside in the collective unconscious. And from a Jungian perspective, the Kraken represents the chaotic, uncontrollable aspects of the mass psyche that can rise from the depths when we least expect it. I also have 2 videos, well technically 4 videos, regarding both the collective unconscious and 2 kind of about the Kraken, where I go also much deeper into this as well, for those who want to know much more about this particular archetype. Where next, Chronos is the Greek personification of time, which represents the inevitable passage of time and the destructive forces associated with it. And in Jungian analysis, Chronos can be seen as the archetype of the devouring father, symbolizing the relentless march of time that consumes all things. Engaging with Chronos means grappling with our mortality and the impermanence of life. so prompting a deeper understanding of the cycles of creation and destruction within the psyche, which also directly ties into the archetype of death, which from a Jungian lens symbolizes transformation, the end of one phase and the beginning of another. So death is not just a literal end, but a metaphorical process of letting go of old identities, beliefs, and patterns, as much as tied to the impermanence of life and the dissolution of the ego. And the death archetype thus involves facing the fear of the unknown and the inevitability of change, which can potentially lead to growth and renewal, yet also can cause destabilization. Where finally the giant serpent Jormungandr from Norse mythology also is very much tied to these kind of themes as well, as it represents the cyclical nature of life and the encompassing, often threatening forces of the unconscious. Jormungandr, encircling the world, in that way embodies the boundary between the known and the unknown, chaos and order. And from a Jungian lens, this giant serpent symbolizes the repressed and chaotic aspects of the psyche that must be confronted and integrated to achieve wholeness. And it can be both as a symbol for, more challenging personal aspects, but really, in the deepest sense, tied to collective psychological aspects. So, regarding the mass psyche, as much as the Kraken represents something similar. And facing this serpent, well, it basically involves acknowledging the deep, often fearsome truths within ourselves and the world. And thus understanding the balance between destructive and creative forces, which is key in going beyond good and evil. And the splitting of categories into good and evil also directly ties into what is called the Scapegoat Complex, which is very much tied to also the categories of redemption and sin. And I want to, for this video now, go first into the important aspects of the Scapegoat Complex before diving deeper into how to overcome it and really the journey towards the monad and that what lies beyond the abyss. Firstly, there is the victim-child aspect, and this aspect relates to the wounded inner child, which symbolizes unresolved emotional pain or trauma from past experiences, often stemming from childhood, because we're obviously victim-child. Even though later traumas can also have its impact as well, or can compound any existing trauma. So there is that too. Where another important aspect is the wanderer, which represents the individual's journey of feeling lost or disconnected, both physically and emotionally, which reflects a sense of aimlessness or searching for meaning and identity in life, which for people who watch John Vervaeke would fall into, the belonging crisis, but also the meaning crisis. Where another more challenging aspect is the accuser aspect, and in the modern complex, the accuser aspect evolved into, basically what people would call the inner critic, which assumes the role of a condemning judge that demands absolute perfection and adherence to rigid norms. Frequently, this aspect remains detached from awareness, concealed close to the inner child seeking acceptance, which also often leads to perfectionism tendencies or taking on more burdens than needed, which is tied to a sense of duty or wanting to be good, which also can just manifest itself in people-pleasing kind of tendencies as well. And this accuser aspect also directly ties to the priest aspect as well, because this aspect is the embodiment of moral and societal norms, values, and expectations. And it symbolizes the internalized voice of authority or conscience that guides individuals' decisions and actions based on societal, familial, or moral standards. And this has a role in perpetuating the scapegoat complex through judgment and the promise of redemption, which can perpetuate feelings of unworthiness and helplessness. often also tied to an external redeemer figure. And this is an external figure or force that is looked to for salvation or deliverance from suffering or adversity. And this aspect involves placing hope or reliance on someone or something outside of oneself to bring about resolution or salvation. And there is something regarding the accepting self as something, that's important in the journey. Though this is something to be, as an experience, internalized, as the actual thing, which is the Redeemer, is the internal Redeemer, which is, this next part. And this is the inner essence within ourselves, what some call the higher self, but really is the true self, the self with a capital S, what the Jungians would be talking about, the center of the psyche, but also the wholeness of who we are. And it really boils down to the person who we were and what our fullest unique potential is, the gift hidden within us that we can share with the world. And these aspects, especially regarding the victim child and the internal redeemer, are key regarding overcoming the split of both scapegoat and redeemer, which also ties directly towards darkness and light, sin and redemption, and with it, chaos and order and life and death. Which also is really about bringing together the victim child and the inner redeemer in that sense, through the Arkteia and Koryos type of rites of passage, which links to kind of a path to assertiveness, which is key in overcoming that. And when it comes to the Arkteia linked to Artemis and Koryos linked to Wotan, these patterns, this is the pathway to heal the Scapegoat Complex and thus in the end finally transcend this distinction of order and chaos. And each of these are different ancient rites of passage which tackle the wanderer and the victim child archetype. So these rituals connected to ecstatic dance and warrior training are key in cultivating assertiveness. Reconnect back to instinct and with this overcome feelings of helplessness and cultivate the needed ego strength to challenge the inner critic. So really at the same time dismantling the Freudian superego in the process. And with this slow cultivation of assertiveness, at the same time any people-pleasing tendencies that need to be challenged as well, which really it kind of helps with, but also that kind of persona really has to be challenged, as it is what keeps the victim child aspect locked up. And this process of challenging this persona takes time and can be uncomfortable. Well, it is uncomfortable. I've been there myself, and it is very uncomfortable, because you don't want to let go of that and you try to play other people's therapist or kind of quote unquote and want to help other people, and you end up externalizing the victim child, the inner child that's wounded onto other people, and kind of like go about like that for a long time. And it's a whole business and it takes time to have it sink in. So if you're there, then just take it easy, you'll get there. The biggest thing regarding this, unconsciously it's often perceived it's providing worth to oneself. Well, at least I'm doing these things, so there's some sense of worth, tied to that behavior. Or really the underlying motivation can be that if I care for others, they will surely finally care for me. Really in an unconscious hope to be accepted. Though these underlying dynamics operate unconsciously, and as such, the person would consciously associate themselves with a caregiving role, even if really their inner child is driving the underlying behavior, which in most cases, as the general pattern of people sought out to be taken care of, are the ones that are emotionally distant, such as the distorted Apollo-type animus or the type disconnected from their anima. These would be unable to actually create the true, genuine connection needed, which is also why such individuals are sought out, as this emotional distance keeps the victim child associated with vulnerability and emotional honesty at bay. However, this pattern tends to create friction where long-term frustrations that the persona can't allow burst forth at later times, leading to, for instance, anger outbursts or other relational problems. And what is important regarding the scapegoat complex in the last stages when dealing with the victim-child aspect, which also ties to the divine child archetype and with it the self-child, is that this process should be handled with care. Sylvia Brinton Pereira in her case studies had noticed that regarding this aspect, often a certain duality is present within the tight core belief, so with it, this part of the complex. And this duality, for me, for instance, tied to the duality of either no one cares and can show kindness, or if they do it, it is because they are paid to do so or have something in mind for a particular gain or hidden motive. And this belief directly also ties into the underlying unworthiness that the victim-child aspect feels regarding acceptance by the self. And this being the accepting self, instead of the inner critic that is mistaken as the self. So the whole and center of the psyche of the individual, which also ties to the soul. So for a while already, what I kind of started to figure out is that, well, this is the one wound one cannot heal on one's own. Because you need the experience of the accepting self to really feel that, because you can cognitively do a lot of things and try to understand a lot of things, but when it comes to the victim child and the anima as well, it's a felt experience, and you kind of need to feel that for that to actually start to sink in, because only through affect can we really change. Though the final goal of the corrective experience is not to become dependent on the individual and keep projecting the accepting self onto the other, as the goal of this is the process of internalization of the experience and the tight idea of genuine kindness and care existing in the world, which is what the victim child needs to feel. And this experience being key for the emotional self to realize this, as like I said, any cognitive work on its own is insufficient to break through the complex. So the processing of the underlying deep-seated emotions, which, if you have such a corrective experience, will start to come up, is what breaks down the psychological complex itself. And the processing of emotions is key. So in the end, this allows the tight grief, feelings of abandonment, worthlessness, or, any other feelings like feeling unloved and uncared for to be processed, which is part of the process of, bringing these contents from the unconscious into consciousness, which also ties to the scapegoat complex and any linked trauma that the victim child and with it the self child carries, which also at the same time allows for the healing of the anima or animus, which similarly is often wounded as well. So how more these emotions that are tied to the complex are processed, how more of a clear connection to the self can be established, where feelings of warmth and underlying care, which tie directly to the platonic forms of the parental figures and the accepting self, can arise from within the individual. Thus, through this, re-establishing the link with the self and the wholeness of the individual. We're also moving beyond notions of sin and virtue, good and bad, and order and chaos start to become necessary, which is also, part of diving into the abyss, because that's kind of also when you start to, face the archetype of death in a way, and like other primal archetypes you've kind of already been facing in this process earlier on regarding, the Koryos and Arkteia, regarding the bear and and the wolf, Fenrir in some sense, integrating these primal energies. But at the same time, there's the need to kind of face the impermanence of life itself as well, which ties into the death archetype and, various other archetypes that reside in the abyss. But in the grander sense, the monad, which I want to go deeper into later. And really, it's this combination of emotional processing and seeing through these dualities, which is really the final push in overcoming the complex. Because through this, one moves beyond the patriarchal and civilizational borders put on the divine, which create the underlying psychological structure that creates the foundation for the existence of the scapegoat complex itself. Now, so when it comes to the duality of order and chaos, for instance, well, I talked in the video regarding solar madness how this distorted Apollonian Dionysian duality creates a distortion in how humanity sees itself. It becomes a sort of self-deception brought about by this lens of good versus evil, order versus chaos, where the two sides throughout history fighting each other are the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. If we, take Nietzsche's duality, and both present themselves as champions of different values. The Dionysian often appears as advocates of empathy, social justice, and inclusivity, while the Apollonian emphasizes tradition, order, and authority. However, beneath these surface ideals, both sides can exhibit distorted Apollonian Dionysian duality traits. And I also don't really suggest for you to watch this video if you want to know more about that, as I won't go deeper into that within this video. However, this idea is still relevant to what we will talk about later within this video, as this is as much connected to a conflict between the collective shadow and the Skyfather as transcendent spiritual function in the collective unconscious. However, there is a force that transcends both, which is the monad. And when it comes to this, it is about bringing a sharper and more experiential focus on one's living connection to the monad, which is the way truly out of the duality that traps one in the duality of order and chaos. For the world is duality, and Abraxas, or the monad, is the synthesis that solves the contradiction. That is to say, they represent the union of opposites. And as Jung says, the spirit of true spirituality is actually becoming oneself with the divine self. However, that can be done only by the self-realization of what this actually means. That is to say, Zagreus, or the suffering scapegoat, and the Redeemer is their own self, where Dionysus Zagreus, or Yahus, is such a symbol of the self. Where Jung further stated that it's no wonder why the Westerner is so prone to devalue himself, since he's placing all that represents goodness and even badness, but overall completeness, outside of himself, having emptied themselves of everything that they are. So they have become, like a friend of mine put it in simple terms, an empty bookshelf. But the thing is that in actuality, we are like a single raindrop reflecting all the other raindrops in the spider web of life. So we're much more interconnected than we think. But it also means that in that way, if unconscious and not yet moved past the state of eternal eclipse, where the actual reality and true state of one's being has not been yet discovered and illuminated, well, we similarly become internally a reflection of the world, as much as the world then becomes a reflection of us and all that dwell in it. Similarly, our culture is a reflection of the internal state of being of its people. And when it comes, to the current state of eternal eclipse for humanity, well, it's not a punishment by any god or some original sin that caused this. It's part of the natural state of being. And the purpose of the rites and individuation rituals in general is to become truly conscious. Because only then can one truly become a seer and see the world for what it is, as the end of the world is always now for those who do not see. And when it comes to moving beyond order and chaos and, good and evil and life and death, an important part regarding this also ties directly into two aspects of the scapegoat complex, the scapegoat and redeemer. And this distinction between scapegoat, sufferer, and redeemer / healer, denying the former and clinging to the latter, is something to be overcome, because as it leads to the whole idea of wanting to alleviate the suffering of others. And there is something to be said about, yes, there's nothing wrong about alleviating the suffering of others and helping people out and doing good things. But we have to also keep in mind that the goal of individuation and the entire goal of, if one wants to overcome the scapegoat complex and move beyond this kind of dualistic state, is that one has to realize the inner redeemer, so the self, and connect to that. And really it can lead to not realizing that a person's suffering itself is not something to be just taken from them or only just alleviated, but that it also needs to be understood, seen, felt, and thus transformed. Like parts of the self that hold trauma, for instance, or emotions like grief and sadness, should not be transcendent but felt and held. To truly understand the underlying message is only through feeling through our suffering and deeply understanding it can we heal and become whole. As denying our own suffering leads to the externalization of it onto the world. And even if we want to act with deep compassion and have wisdom, we can not alleviate others' suffering unless we have felt our own. Yet even then, people should be helped to realize their own inner redeemer. The only way to do this is not by avoiding our own suffering, but to feel through it, nurture the fragmented parts within. And through this process comes healing, transformation, and with it, wholeness and deeper states of true non-duality. Because the thing is that if one actually allows affect to update consciousness and actually, work through it and feel through it, unconscious content is gonna rise up and you start to work through it. And if you start to work through it both cognitively and emotionally, well, then you actually start to work through it. And a lot of things are gonna start to become more and more clear over time. And it's a process that takes time. But eventually, when you keep working through it, you start, for instance, to see, in my particular case with for instance, an aspect of the anima, the anima was bringing something up regarding past grief. And that's kind of a pattern that started to be brought into consciousness, where I was projecting the past loss of someone and trying to find them in other people. And obviously that doesn't really work. But that's something I unconsciously was doing until I became conscious of it and was suddenly realizing, wait, that's what I'm doing? Yeah, no, that doesn't really work. And so I faced it and worked through it, and then it became more and more clear, well, that's kind of what I've been doing the whole time. Well, no shit that it didn't work out and that I acted in this and this way and all that kind of stuff. And that's part of it. That's really part of it. Because, that's kind of how that happens. We can't avoid our emotions. They're there for a reason, with their own important message linked to various unconscious content that we can become, conscious of and do something with in a healthy manner. And from this kind of work, arises really then a different kind of liberation. I would say a balanced path between desire and selflessness, and the movement towards the monad. The monad, in that sense, is the supreme being, divinity, or you could say the totality of all things. And really, it's divinity beyond any concept. The first being and totality of all beings, referring in ancient cosmogony to the source and indivisible origin of all that is and was. And in various philosophical and spiritual traditions, the monad is considered the ultimate indivisible source of all existence. So really it represents the absolute unity from which all multiplicity arises. And union with the monad, which is needed for this process, especially in the last stages, involves transcending individual ego identity and experiencing mystical union with the divine, characterized by ineffable unity, where all distinctions between self and other, order and chaos, and also the subject-object distinction dissolves. So you become one with the experience of the world itself. This also means letting go of rigid self-concepts and attachments to personal identity. And through this, the ego undergoes a transformation from being a separate, self-centered entity to becoming an expression of a larger unified consciousness. And this does not mean the complete eradication of the ego, but rather its alignment with a higher sense of purpose and unity, where the monad is also the force where destructive and creative forces coexist in its potentiality. The purest expression of raw psychic energy that can either become distorted and create destruction and chaos, or become a creative force that brings about life and renewal. And as such, it is often seen as the highest expression of divine consciousness, or basically the ultimate reality beyond human comprehension. And in the deepest sense, if one has gone through this process, well, it starts to shift a whole lot of things regarding order and chaos as well. Because if we look at it from this perspective of the monad, well, in that sense, order and how we understand it as only physical structures such as institutions, buildings, and other forms of societal infrastructure next to societal norms. Well, from that lens, it's a human misconception, really, as it does not reflect the full nature of the structure of reality itself. Because really, the true higher order hidden from the understanding of most are the processes of life, not just physical structure, and really the processes of the psyche, and that what orders the cosmos. And these processes are an important and more higher structure and order, which includes both order and chaos. So even though material structure and the world we see around us are physically present, falling into, both the material and kind of like, structure as we normally would think about it, or even psychic structures when it comes to societal norms, these are as much connected to the force of change as well. A structure and a material, or sense of norms, are not truly stable long-term. They are subject to change and the forces of quote-unquote chaos, or better said, disruption and change, where order can be as creative and nurturing as it can be destructive and stifling, as much as disruption and change can be a necessary force for positive and beneficial transformation and renewal, and thus creative, and not only destructive in nature. In a deeper sense, processes in themselves have something structured and ordered to them as well, as the water cycle, is in order of sorts as well, for instance, to give one example from nature. Though the things within the processes are not static. So while structures may exist, they are not the essence of order, the real higher truths of existence. Instead, order is found in the ongoing changing and interconnected processes that underlie the appearance of stability. So in that sense, everything that appears stable and as if it is material truly is empty, meaning there is no inherent rigid something to be found. That's an idea and concept in our minds. This might then also be the origin of the fear and need for control that leads to the othering of nature. because it's our fear of the inherent ambiguity and true fluid and ever-changing nature of reality, symbolized often through the symbolism of death. And the tarot card of death similarly symbolizes the ever-changing aspects of nature next to the idea of death and rebirth. This being what the Wotan archetype, sovereignty goddess and Dionysus are connected to as well. Hence why they have been relegated to the collective shadow, as they challenge the perceived order and sense of structure and comfort we perceive from the perception of stability. Even if in actuality this is only a perception, as true stability can only be found in relationship to the ever-changing nature of reality. In that sense, really, it's not a fear of death or the unknown that we have, but a fear of life, as this is the reality of life itself, beyond comforting narratives that split this reality into duality. Kronos ties exactly into this as well, and with this comes the splitting of things into order and chaos, life and death, good and evil, virtue and sin, which is part of the Scapegoat Complex, which splits things also into scapegoat and redeemer, the shadow and light, thus creating the shadow that Jung writes about, as by Kronos consuming these various archetypes and thus repressing them, it creates also the state of projection. So much like Kronos represents the state between consciousness and the unconscious, most humans are in such a state as well. What could be also called the state of titanic projection into matter, as the Orphic teachings talk about, or solar madness as it has also been coined. But in a deeper sense, which is an interesting thing regarding Kronos, is that as a figure, he is dual in nature, so both tied to the unconscious and raw primal energy in its original form, as much as having become the source of its restriction. So it's a dual figure, both tied to the fear of the full uncontrolled release of the primal and its strict control, where Kronos, as a personification of time, embodies both the devouring, destructive aspect of time, chaos, and the structuring, orderly aspect that brings about stability and continuity. Hence, Saturn, which is the Roman version of Kronos, being tied both to order and structure, yet also being unchained at Saturnalia, where it becomes the opposite, and the primal energies are unleashed for a time. As what is repressed does not disappear, it becomes the shadow, which is then projected onto others, which can also create the phenomena of scapegoating. And when archetypal forces are repressed, they are not integrated into consciousness. So instead, they become projected outwardly, leading to a divided perception of the world, which is the emptying of the metaphorical bookshelf. And this state being marked by duality, projection, and a disconnection from true consciousness.